What if someone told you that learning isn't supposed to feel confusing, frustrating, or heavy? Most people accept the idea that difficulty is a sign of progress, as if the mind were a stubborn machine that has to be forced to understand. But think about this for a moment. Whenever people truly grasp something, whether it's a simple idea or a complex principle, it never feels heavy at all. It feels light, almost obvious, as if the idea had been waiting there the whole time. So the real puzzle is this: why does learning feel hard in the first place, and what does that difficulty actually mean? There's a strange habit people share across cultures and generations. When a concept becomes difficult, they tend to push harder in the same way, repeating the same steps, hoping a breakthrough will suddenly appear. A student sits with a textbook, staring at the same paragraph as if the meaning might leak into the mind by sheer force. Another flips through pages again and again, whispering lines as though repetition alone could create understanding. Someone might fill pages with notes, copying every sentence, believing that a thick notebook is proof of learning. But when these people return to the material a few days later, they often discover that almost nothing has truly settled. The ideas wander around, loosely attached, ready to evaporate. Why does this happen? Because many people confuse the sensation of effort with the experience of understanding. Hard work by itself does not produce clarity. The mind has been built over thousands of years to recognize patterns, extract meaning, and connect ideas naturally. When learning feels impossibly hard, it usually means the mind is being asked to hold fragments without connection, symbols without context, or words without meaning. People push and pull at ideas, but the ideas remain unanchored. Think of a classroom filled with students copying lines from the board. Their hands move, their eyes follow, but their thoughts drift. They cling to the hope that writing down information will somehow transform it into understanding. Yet if you ask them moments later what the idea truly means, many would hesitate. They have recorded something but not internalized it. Observers have long noticed this. People often mistake motion for progress and activity for comprehension. Imagine someone reading a textbook on mathematics. The symbols march across the page, lines of equations, strange Greek letters, unfamiliar diagrams. The person reads each line, convinced that reading is equal to learning. But reading mathematical expressions is not like reading a story. A mind can glide over a line of mathematics without grasping any real substance. The eyes move, but the mind does not. And yet people continue, believing they are studying simply because they are exposed to the material. Here's a different picture. Someone picks up a science text and begins reading the explanations on motion, energy, or light. The descriptions might use familiar words, but the ideas behind them may not be fully clear. Still, the reader moves on, reassuring themselves that everything will make sense later. But the later never comes. The reader has stacked unclear ideas on top of other unclear ideas, building a tower of confusion that eventually collapses. This is the real problem. People learn in ways that feel like learning but do not work like learning. The important truth is that the mind thrives on understanding, not memorizing. You may recall a time without telling a personal story when classrooms relied heavily on recitation. Students repeated facts, definitions, and formulas aloud. The room might have sounded impressive, filled with confident voices reciting knowledge. But ask those same students to explain what the facts actually mean, or how they fit into anything larger, and many would stumble. Recitation is not comprehension. It never has been. This pattern existed ages before any modern tools were created, and it continues wherever people confuse the appearance of learning with its reality. People have always assumed that if an idea is difficult, the solution must be to push harder in the same direction. They believe the mind is like a heavy door that opens only if enough pressure is applied. But the mind works more like a lock. If you don't have the right key, the right approach, no amount of force will let you in. A small shift in strategy can do more than hours of strain. So consider this question: what makes learning feel easy? Not effortless, but natural. What makes an idea suddenly click into place? It is not repetition. It is not memorization. It is not copying. The mind lights up when something makes sense. You can watch this happen in any classroom from any decade. A student struggles with a concept. They twist the idea in their thoughts, uncertain of how it works. Then a teacher draws a simple diagram on the chalkboard, or uses a familiar example, or rephrases the explanation in a way that touches something the student already understands. Suddenly the idea becomes clear. The student's face changes. The difficulty dissolves. Nothing has been added except clarity. This is the moment people often mistake for magic. But the truth is far simpler. Understanding removes difficulty. Confusion is not a sign of incapacity. It is a sign of a missing connection. When the connection is found, the idea unfolds naturally. This means something important. If learning feels constantly difficult, the method is wrong. Think of a person studying geometry with a ruler and a notebook. They draw shape after shape, copying them from the textbook. But if you ask them to explain why a certain angle behaves the way it does, they can't. They've been drawing without thinking. The activity gives them the illusion of familiarity, but not the substance of understanding. Now picture a different student who studies the same chapter but focuses on the idea behind each shape. Why does a triangle have special rules? Why does a circle behave differently? What do these simple shapes reveal about space? That student learns more in half the time because each idea is anchored. People often underestimate how much the mind depends on meaning. The brain resists empty facts. It embraces coherent structures, relationships, and patterns. When you try to force an idea onto the mind without giving it context, it slides off. When the idea connects to something real, something already understood, the mind holds on to it. So the first shift is recognizing that learning should feel like ideas falling into place, not being hammered into position. The second shift is understanding that confusion is a doorway, not a wall. And the third shift is realizing that difficulty isn't a sign of depth. It's often a sign of missing foundations. This is why many people struggle for years with subjects they believe they are bad at. It is rarely a matter of talent. More often, the foundations were unclear early on, and everything built on top feels uncertain. But the beauty of learning is that foundations can be rebuilt at any time. The mind does not close its doors simply because an idea was misunderstood years earlier. So here is the essential idea of this first part. When learning feels hard, it is not the learner that is wrong, it is the approach. Learning becomes natural when ideas are understood at their roots. And understanding begins when we stop pretending that difficulty is a badge of honor. If people looked closely at the moments when learning truly works, they'd notice something subtle but powerful. Understanding grows best when ideas are broken down into their simplest possible forms. Not simplified to the point of distortion, but reduced to their essential meaning. The mind naturally seeks the core of an idea, the basic principle from which everything else flows. When people try to learn complicated material by holding on to all the complexity at once, the mind becomes overwhelmed. But when the same material is reduced to its basic components, clarity returns. Think of someone reading a thick physics book. The pages are filled with equations, diagrams of forces, explanations of unfamiliar phenomena. Many students flip through such a book and become convinced that physics itself is complicated. But if you watch a skilled teacher explain the same ideas on a blackboard, you might see only a few lines, a simple diagram, and a small handful of key concepts. Suddenly, a subject that once looked like a mountain becomes a series of small steps. The transformation isn't in the subject, it's in the way the subject is approached. This principle applies everywhere. A student learning grammar may feel overwhelmed by technical terms, subordinate clauses, participles, conditional structures. But if someone explains that all sentences simply express relationships between ideas, and that grammar is just a way of organizing those relationships, the entire subject shrinks into understandable form. The same happens in geometry, in chemistry, in philosophy, even in everyday problem solving. Complexity is never the enemy. Misunderstood simplicity is. People sometimes ask why their minds struggle with certain concepts even after hours of study. The answer is almost always the same. The idea is being treated as something foreign instead of something familiar. But every idea, no matter how advanced, is built from things the mind already knows. The challenge is to uncover those connections. For example, Consider the idea of acceleration in motion. A student may see the formula in a textbook and become worried because it uses symbols they don't understand. But acceleration is nothing more than the rate at which something changes its speed. Anyone who has felt a cart begin to roll faster down a hill has experienced acceleration directly. The formula is simply a distilled representation of this familiar experience. But when the student treats the formula as a mysterious object, the mind rejects it. When the same student recognizes that the formula is simply a compact way of describing a real experience, the mind welcomes it. This reveals another important principle. The mind learns best through familiar anchors. When new ideas attach themselves to things already understood, learning becomes steady and reliable. When new ideas float without anchors, learning becomes slippery and fragile. This is why people remember stories more easily than lists, concepts more easily than formulas, and principles more easily than isolated facts. Picture a room where students are preparing for an examination. Some students write flashcards filled with definitions. Others copy entire chapters onto fresh sheets of paper, believing the act of writing will preserve the information in their memory. But consider what actually happens when someone writes a definition they don't understand. The hand copies the words, the eyes watch the lines form, but the mind gains nothing. The activity consumes time, but the time produces no insight. Meanwhile, another student who spends the same amount of time understanding a single idea, really understanding it, builds a foundation that will support everything else that comes afterward. This difference in approach leads to a major insight. Quality of understanding far outweighs quantity of material. People often try to learn too much at once because they fear falling behind, or because they believe learning is measured by how many pages they've covered, how many facts they've collected. But learning is not a race along a straight road. It is the construction of a structure. A structure built quickly may rise tall, but if the walls are weak, it collapses under its own weight. Imagine someone studying mechanics in a classroom. The teacher draws a simple block on the board and places arrows to represent forces. Students observe quietly, writing down what is drawn. But if they never ask themselves what these arrows represent, if they never think about pushing a heavy chair across the floor or feeling the resistance of gravity while lifting a book, then those arrows become empty symbols. But when a student ties the arrows to real experiences, everything becomes intuitive. The subject stops being a collection of abstract drawings and becomes a way of describing everyday life. People sometimes assume that learning must be serious and heavy because the subjects themselves are heavy. But the seriousness of a subject does not determine the difficulty of understanding. What determines difficulty is the approach. Someone who approaches a subject with curiosity, who treats it like a puzzle waiting to be solved rather than a burden to be carried, learns faster and more deeply. Curiosity unlocks the natural process of exploration. The mind becomes active, not passive. Instead of waiting for meaning to arrive, the learner seeks it out. This brings up another timeless truth. The mind is not a container to be filled, but a network to be expanded. You cannot pour facts into the mind like water into a bucket. Facts remain disconnected until the mind weaves them into patterns. Pattern making is the real work of learning. It has always been this way, long before textbooks were printed or classrooms were built. Human beings have understood the world by finding connections. Once the connection appears, the mind holds on to the idea without effort. Think about a moment when a teacher explains something simple, perhaps the motion of a pendulum, the balancing of a chemical equation, or the behavior of light passing through a prism. The teacher draws a simple picture and uses ordinary words. Suddenly the student understands. But what changed? Not the student's intelligence, not the teacher's knowledge. What changed was the shape of the idea. It became graspable. It entered the mind in a form the mind naturally accepts. This reveals a final principle for this part. Learning is not the accumulation of difficulty. It is the reduction of difficulty. When people say, "This subject is hard," what they often mean is, "This subject has not yet been explained in a simple enough form." When people say, "I'm not good at this," they usually mean, "The foundations I need were never made clear." There is nothing wrong with difficulty appearing at the beginning. Difficulty is a sign that a concept has not yet been broken down into its essential pieces. But staying in difficulty, remaining stuck there, is unnecessary. Once the right explanation appears, the difficulty dissolves. This is why students who struggle privately often experience sudden breakthroughs when someone rephrases the idea. A small shift in framing makes all the difference. These principles might seem simple, but they change everything. When people stop treating learning as a punishment and begin treating it as a process of uncovering simplicity, their progress accelerates, their confidence grows, and the subjects that once felt impossible become natural. There's a moment in any deep study when a person realizes something fundamental. Ideas are not separate islands. They are part of a single landscape. When learning feels difficult, it is usually because the learner is trying to cross from one island to another without noticing the bridges that already exist. Those bridges are built from simple principles, patterns that repeat across different subjects, different problems, different situations. Once someone sees these patterns, learning becomes far easier than most people imagine. Think about how often people treat subjects as isolated compartments. Mathematics over here, physics over there, language somewhere else, and philosophy in its own corner. Students flip through textbooks as if each subject requires a completely different kind of thinking. But look closer, and you'll notice something remarkable. Every subject is simply a way of describing relationships. Mathematics describes numerical relationships. Physics describes the relationships in nature. Language describes relationships between ideas. And philosophy explores relationships of thought itself. When someone sees these underlying structures, learning stops feeling like a collection of different tasks and starts feeling like one unified process. The mind becomes more flexible. It begins to look for the common threads instead of memorizing disconnected fragments. This shift alone can remove enormous difficulty from learning. Consider someone reading a dense chapter in a textbook, perhaps a chapter on waves, or classical literature, or geometric proofs. As long as the reader treats each sentence as a separate object, the chapter feels heavy. The mind must constantly switch tracks, picking up one idea, dropping another, juggling multiple definitions and terms. But if the reader instead asks, "What is the main idea tying all of this together?" the chapter transforms. The details begin to orbit around a central concept, making them easier to follow, easier to recall, and easier to apply. This illustrates another timeless truth. The mind remembers meaning far more than it remembers detail. People often try to memorize details because they believe details are the essence of knowledge. But meaning is the essence. Details are the decoration. When meaning is clear, details fall naturally into place. When meaning is missing, details become noise. You can see this in a classroom during a lesson on literature. Students might be asked to remember dates, character names, and chapter summaries. Some memorize all this, others forget quickly. But the students who understand the theme, why the characters behave as they do, what the conflict represents, what the story is truly exploring, retain the material long after the memorized facts have faded. They've understood the shape of the idea, not just its surface. The same holds true in the sciences. A student might memorize formulas for kinetic energy, potential energy, or the conservation of momentum. But if the student never grasps the underlying principle that energy and momentum describe how nature keeps track of motion and interaction, then the formulas remain fragile. Yet once that principle becomes clear, every formula becomes an expression of the same idea. Learning flows smoothly. This leads naturally to another key point about difficulty. Difficulty is often the result of studying without purpose. When someone does not know why they are learning something, their mind has no place to put the information. Purpose acts like a shelf. Without it, everything slides off. With it, everything has a place. Think of a student studying geometry. If the goal is simply to pass an examination, the student may try to memorize every step of every proof. But if the student understands that geometry is about describing the structure of space, how shapes behave, how distances relate, how angles interact, then every proof becomes easier to follow. The mind recognizes the direction of the reasoning. The learning is purposeful. Now consider what happens when a person sits with a difficult text and forces themselves to continue reading despite confusion. Many people have done this, turning pages, hoping the next line will suddenly bring clarity. But the next line rarely does. Why? Because confusion doesn't disappear by moving forward. Confusion disappears by stepping back. If the foundation is shaky, adding more material only makes things worse. This is why effective learners pause the moment confusion appears. They re-express the idea in simpler terms. They draw a diagram. They restate the idea aloud in plain language. They rebuild the foundation before continuing. This habit, returning to simplicity when confusion appears, is one of the most powerful tools in learning. It has been used for centuries by people who truly understand their subjects. It does not require talent or special ability. It requires only the willingness to clarify instead of push forward blindly. Another deep truth about learning is that understanding grows through active engagement, not passive exposure. People sometimes believe that sitting with a textbook open is enough, but the mind is not a sponge. It is a sculptor. It shapes ideas through effort, through questioning, through playing with concepts, through checking whether an explanation truly makes sense. Picture someone studying a chapter in physics. They read that force equals mass times acceleration. Many students will nod and move on, but some will stop and ask, why does this make sense? What happens if the mass is large but the change in speed is small? What if the mass is tiny but the speed changes rapidly? These simple questions spark the mind into action. They turn the formula from a static object into a living idea. Or imagine someone learning about grammar. They read that subjects and predicates form the core of every sentence. Instead of memorizing this, an active learner might take a piece of paper and write a simple sentence. Then they break it apart, identifying its pieces. They try constructing a new sentence and analyze that one too. This interplay of construction and analysis makes the idea real. Active engagement takes many forms. Summarizing, drawing, explaining, questioning, testing oneself. These are timeless tools. People used them long before modern classrooms existed. These tools require no equipment beyond a pencil, a sheet of paper, and a willingness to think. All of this leads us toward a crucial insight. Learning becomes easier when the learner becomes a participant, not a spectator. Another aspect worth exploring is the role of curiosity. Many assume that curiosity is something that comes and goes uncontrollably, like weather. But curiosity can be cultivated. When people allow themselves to wonder about simple things, why a shadow changes shape, why a wheel keeps turning once it starts, why certain arguments are persuasive, they awaken the mind's natural appetite for understanding. This appetite pulls learning forward. It transforms study from a duty into an exploration. Curiosity shrinks difficulty because it motivates the mind to search for meaning instead of waiting for meaning to be delivered. As learning deepens, something interesting happens. The learner begins to see that ideas are not just things to be known, but tools to navigate the world. A student who understands proportions sees balance everywhere, from recipes to architecture. Someone who truly understands force sees the world in motion. Someone who understands language sees how thought is shaped. This realization makes learning feel worthwhile, even invigorating. The difficulty that once felt like a barrier becomes a signpost, pointing toward understanding yet to be uncovered. And eventually, the learner discovers a final truth. Learning is not simply about acquiring knowledge, it is about refining thought. The better people learn, the sharper their thinking becomes. They become more precise in how they analyze, more careful in how they reason, more creative in how they approach problems. This refinement of thought is the true reward of learning. Now think about what happens when a learner reaches this stage. They no longer fear difficulty. They no longer rush through confusion. They no longer measure progress by pages covered or hours spent. They measure progress by clarity. They move at the natural pace of understanding, and because of this, their learning accelerates. Learning does not need to feel like an uphill battle. When approached with the right mindset and the right methods, learning becomes an exploration guided by curiosity, clarity, and connection. The mind is built for this. It always has been. And so the final message is simple. When learning feels hard, it's not because the learner is inadequate. It's because the path to understanding has not yet been uncovered. But the moment clarity is found, even through the smallest shift, the difficulty melts away. Understanding replaces confusion. Insight replaces frustration, and the world becomes larger, more connected, and more meaningful. Continue learning, but do it with simplicity, curiosity, and clarity. Let understanding be the guide, not strain. Because once learning becomes natural, it becomes a lifelong companion, not a temporary chore.